Welcome back to Decode Healthcare with Harshal. In part 12 of our series, we completely conquered the leg and ankle. Today, in part 13 of our Musculoskeletal Explainer, we're going to tackle something a bit more intricate. We're translating the dense CPT guidelines for the complex architecture of the foot and toes, specifically codes 28001 through 28899. We are turning all of that dense text into a clear, visual map. We've got a ton of ground to cover today, from chronic deformities all the way to sudden trauma, so let's just jump right in.
But before we even look at a single code, I want you to think about this for a second. Why is the foot literally notorious for being the trickiest part of the musculoskeletal codebook? It's a massive trap for coding errors, right? Well, the secret to preventing those errors and keeping those claims from getting denied isn't just about memorizing a bunch of numbers, it's about completely mastering the physical anatomy. You absolutely have to know exactly where your surgeon is working.
Okay, let's break down this underlying architecture in plain English. There are three main zones of the foot we have to navigate. First, at the bottom, we have the tarsal bones. Just think of these as your ankle and heel bones. Moving up, we find the metatarsal bones, which make up that long midfoot area. And finally, at the very top, we have the phalanges, which is just the fancy medical term for the toes. You really want to lock these three zones in your mind: tarsals, metatarsals, and phalanges. Everything we code today depends entirely on which specific zone the surgeon is operating on.
Now, listen closely, because before we look at our first surgical procedure, there is an absolute foundational rule we have to establish. If you skip this, your coding is going to be wrong every single time. I like to call it the golden rule of toe coding.
Here's the deal. Procedures in this section are usually coded per digit. That means if a surgeon fixes a toe, you cannot just submit the CPT code and call it a day. No way. You must append the exact anatomical modifier to tell the insurance company precisely which toe was fixed. For example, you're going to use the modifier TA for the left big toe, or maybe T5 for the right big toe, ranging all the way through T9. These T modifiers, they are your best friends in this section of the book. Do not forget them.
All right, let's get into the heavy hitters. We're talking about repairing bunionectomies, covering codes 28291 through 28299.
This is, without a doubt, one of the biggest and most notoriously tricky topics in all of foot coding. To code a bunionectomy correctly, you really need to understand what the surgeon is actually looking at in the OR. In simple terms, a bunion, which is medically known as hallux valgus, is a painful, bony bump that forms right on the joint at the base of the big toe. It happens when the bones in the front part of the foot shift out of place, pulling that big toe toward the smaller toes and forcing the joint at the base to stick out uncomfortably.
So how do they fix it? Well, to correct the severe angular deformity of hallux valgus, the surgeon doesn't just shave the bump down. They often perform a proximal phalanx osteotomy. And osteotomy just means they actually cut into the bone itself. They remove a wedge from the proximal phalanx, physically shift that bone into a nice straight alignment, and then, to keep it there, that newly aligned bone is secured tight with bone screws. This is heavy-duty structural work.
And that brings us to the single most important CPT guideline for bunions. The code you choose depends entirely on how the surgeon fixes it. You have got to read that operative report like a detective. Did they perform a simpler silver procedure, which essentially just shaves that bony bump off? Or did they perform an osteotomy, actually cutting the metatarsal or phalangeal bones and realigning them with screws like we just talked about? The specific surgical method dictates your final CPT code, so always look for those keywords. Are we just shaving, or are we bone cutting?
Moving slightly away from the big toe, let's demystify code 28285 and talk about hammer toe repairs. Zeroing in on the phalanges again, let's define what we're actually looking at. A hammer toe is exactly what it sounds like. It's a toe that has developed an abnormal, super rigid bend right in its middle joint. Instead of lying nice and flat, it buckles upward, making it look literally just like the strike head of a hammer. And because the toe is structurally frozen in this weird bent position, it requires targeted surgical intervention to essentially force it back flat again. So how does code 208085 actually play out? The procedure usually involves two really fascinating physical steps. First, the surgeon removes a small piece of bone directly at that buckled middle joint to relieve the tension. But honestly, that's not enough to keep it straight long term. Step 2 is where they drive a rigid metal pin, which is called a K-wire, straight through the tip of the toe, running it right down the center of the phalangeal bones. Think of this wire as an internal splint. It rigidly holds the toe in a perfectly flat position while the whole thing heals. Pretty amazing, right?
Okay, so that covers the chronic deformities. Now let's shift gears and look at high-impact trauma procedures, fractures and amputations.
The foot is incredibly susceptible to sudden, unexpected trauma. Imagine a totally relatable real-world scenario. You're at the gym, and you drop a heavy weight squarely onto the top of your midfoot. Ouch. You are very likely looking at a metatarsal fracture. When you're navigating codes 28400 through 28675, your code selection relies heavily on the type of stabilization the surgeon uses. Was it a closed treatment with just some simple manipulation, or did it require an open reduction where the surgeon actually had to open the foot up and stabilize those midfoot bones with tiny plates and screws? Once again, the details in the operative report are going to dictate your exact path.
And then, in the absolute most severe cases of trauma, or perhaps due to an advanced disease like diabetic neuropathy, we have to turn to the amputation codes. Codes 28800 through 28825 cover a wide range of procedures, from mid-tarsal amputations all the way down to partial toe amputations, where a specific section of the phalanges just has to be removed. Which perfectly brings our narrative full circle today. I want to explicitly remind you that selecting the correct code for a partial toe amputation from the 28800 series is only half the battle. You absolutely must remember our golden rule. Any amputation code selected for a specific digit has to be paired with the precise T modifiers we learned at the very beginning of this explainer. You have to tell the payer exactly which toe was removed. Was it T1, T4, or T9? Do not leave money on the table by forgetting your modifiers.
Wow, we have covered an incredible amount of ground today, all the way from the tarsals up to the very tips of the phalanges. But our journey through the musculoskeletal system is far from over. Make sure you hit that subscribe button for Decode Healthcare with Harshal, because you definitely won't want to miss part 14. I'll leave you with this final thought. Are you ready to master the application of casts and strapping? Next time, we are diving deep into codes 29,000 through 29,799. Until then, keep reading those operative reports closely, and I'll see you in the next explainer.